Chapter 3. Living out God's mission and disciple making. Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age." Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20. It is not so much the case that God has a mission for his church in the world, but that God has a church for his mission in the world. Mission was not made for the church was made for mission, God's mission. Christopher J. H. Wright, The Mission of God. My wife refers to Starbucks as the office. I have an actual office, but typically at least half my work week takes place at one of my many branch offices. I like the noise, and I like the people. Starbucks has an atmosphere that invites people to both do their own thing and interact with those around them, which makes it good for either study or meeting with others. And of course, they have good coffee. But mostly I like it because it's one of our culture's watering holes and a good place to make friends with people outside the church. I see my time at Starbucks as an important space for me to live out Christ's command to make disciples. Much has been written in recent years urging the church to step away from a reduced view of the mission of God and to embrace a fuller biblical picture of God's work in the world. These are reminders we need to hear. God is not interested solely in saving souls, but in restoring a broken world and the broken people who inhabit it. He is concerned not just with people getting to heaven when they die, but in seeing his kingdom come to earth and his will be done here as it is in heaven. The church has been rightly urged to minister to people's physical as well as spiritual needs. All of these things are true and need to be embraced as a corrective to much of recent evangelism. God's mission of restoring our fallen world is one of cosmic proportions, and my intention here is not to reduce it in the least. Yet at the same time, we must be careful that in our efforts to be comprehensive, we didn't lose sight of the simplicity of Christ's call and of the individuals he puts in our path. We dare not lose sight of the critical task of evangelism or of the task of seeing those converts spiritually formed into maturing apprentices of Jesus. In other words, we mustn't loosen our grip on Jesus' commands to make disciples. Disciple making. Two approaches. No definition of God's mission can be considered complete if it does not take seriously the command of Jesus to make disciples. Taking Matthew's gospel as paradigmatic, the command to make disciples is a broad one, carrying with it the picture of what a disciple is and does. A commitment to live out the teachings of Jesus, the interconnectedness of Christ's disciples to one another, and the calling to be those sent by God into the world. Those who make disciples are disciples themselves, learning what it means to live as Jesus' apprentices. And the church exists as a missionary community of these disciples, carrying out the Great Commission, as they live by the Great Commandment, even when rightly seen in the larger context of God restoring a broken creation. The heart of God's mission is making people into Jesus' disciples. This command to make disciples has been understood in different ways. Many understood it as evangelism. To make disciples means converting people to saving faith in Jesus. Many others see mere evangelism as a shallow reading of the text and emphasize that these converts need to be discipled, which means attention must be given to the spiritual formation of believers. To them, what Jesus commanded was discipleship, which generally involves some form of working through a curriculum to teach the basics of the faith. Most of us, though, would agree that both evangelism and spiritual formation are part of the disciple-making task. When Jesus says we are to baptize these disciples, we have to conclude that he is referring to those who have come to faith in him. When he tells us to teach these disciples to obey everything he has commanded, we conclude he is also referring to the ongoing spiritual growth of these converts. A disciple is a Christian, not the supercharged version of a Christian, one that is more mature than ordinary Christians, or one that has been through a certain curriculum. A disciple is a person who has trusted in Jesus for salvation, and consequently has enlisted as his apprentice, learning from him how to live and becoming like him in the process. Discipleship is the Christian life, and the goal of Christian life is to become like Jesus. Seeing disciple-making as falling primarily into one of these two categories, evangelism or spiritual formation, has introduced some unnecessary difficulties into the church's task. While these two activities are distinct, I think we would benefit from revising these in a more holistic way. Rather than viewing evangelism and spiritual formation as wholly separate tasks, we need to treat them as overlapping and interrelated aspects of a single task, disciple-making. Model 1. In the model I was trained in, evangelism was basically defined as everything that happens to lead a person toward Christ until that person becomes a Christian. Discipleship was defined as everything that happens to help a person grow in their faith after the person becomes a Christian. The two are totally separate. If I were to draw this model on the back of a napkin, it would look like figure 3.1. The line on the left represents the process of evangelism, and the marks on the line represent different steps a person might take in coming to faith. In this model, a Christian might meet a person, share the gospel with him or her, possibly bring the person to an outreach-oriented event, and lead the person to the point of conversion. The line on the right represents the process of discipleship. In this model, a person would take a new believer through a follow-up process, introduce him or her to reading the Bible, prayer, attending a church, and maybe a small group. This process continues in different forms throughout the believer's life as he or she grows in faith. Between these two lines is a very important gap. Evangelism experts emphasize the importance of minimizing the gap between evangelism and discipleship by following up with a new believer as quickly as possible. Many would say follow-up must begin within the first 24 hours. If the discipleship process does not begin right away, we risk seeing the new believer slip back into his or her former life and never become an active participant in the church. This is the model I was taught, and which I became disillusioned with over time. Why was it that new believers were so prone to fall away if follow-up was not immediate? Was conversion to Christ that fragile a thing? Why were new believers so resistant to follow-up? The most convicting question to me personally was, when had I ever challenged someone to count the cost of being Jesus' disciple? The answer was never. I was selling people a ticket to heaven, not a life of becoming like Jesus. No wonder they weren't returning my calls when I tried to follow up so they could grow in their faith. That wasn't what they had signed up for, and they frankly had no interest in it. When I thought honestly about the results of this approach, I began to wonder how many decisions for Christ were not actual conversions but mere decisions. Impulsive choices made in response to what looked like a pretty good deal. Over time, I began to see that the model I was using was making it more difficult for people to live as actual disciples of Christ. One of the difficulties stems from its over-reliance on Paul's conversion as the normative biblical model for how conversion occurs. It does not take into account other biblical models, most notably the conversion of the 12 disciples. As a result, conversion is treated more as an event and less as a process. For reasons to be discussed later, it is especially important with the postmodern generations to allow conversion to be a process. A second difficulty is that the attrition rate under this model is notoriously high, and rarely are potential disciples truly challenged to consider what it will cost them to follow Jesus. In this excellent study on conversion, Richard Peace makes an interesting observation that encounter evangelism, sharing the gospel with a total stranger, who may or may not be at a place where they care to hear it, may actually serve to inoculate people against the gospel by offering them an inadequate experience of Jesus. In other words, this type of evangelism might do more to repel people than to draw them. Anecdotally, it would seem this is especially true with the postmodern generation. Dan Kimball refers to the postmodern generation as post-Christian because they have encountered some form of Christianity on a small scale, in a family member or portrayed in religious programming, etc., feel they now have an understanding of the faith and have already said thanks but no thanks. This is not to say that in a postmodern culture we will never utilize some form of encounter evangelism, but as we reach out to an increasingly postmodern society, an evangelism approach that fosters process will need to serve as our primary vehicle for outreach. A third difficulty touches on issues of trust and assimilation into the church family. In this model, new believers frequently feel as though they have been sold one thing only to discover that they have bought another. Most respond to promises of eternal life and God's wonderful plan, only later to find out in the follow-up process, if they make it that far, that growth in Christianity is also expected of them, that it involves all kinds of unappealing requirements: attending a church, irrelevant and boring; prayer, foreign; reading the Bible, difficult to understand; witnessing to others, scary; giving, you must be kidding, and more. These surprises frequently lead to disillusioned new believers who may or may not continue in the faith. For those who do continue, growing into a mature and reproducing faith can be exceedingly difficult. The gospel presented to and accepted by them is essentially self-centered, and becoming other-centered often seems an intrusion rather than a normal part of Christian living. Their faith is seen as a personal matter, and the more rigorous demands of following Jesus, such as participating in a community of imperfect people, serving the needs of others, sharing the faith, and so forth, never become more than optional extras. In his study of conversion, Scott McKnight suggests that an overemphasis on personal decision can lead to a personal and ultimately private version of Christianity. And as Dallas Willard says, if this is the Christianity that a person originally accepted, it is very difficult to switch contracts later on. A fourth difficulty in this model is that since evangelism and discipleship are treated as completely separate activities, it feeds a pick-and-choose mentality among believers. Because most of what we do in the typical church is geared toward the spiritual growth of existing members, and because evangelism involves the discomfort of rejection, discipleship becomes the primary activity for believers. Evangelism is seen as optional. It rarely happens in the lives of most believers. In fact, I would contend that one of the greatest barriers to evangelism is the sheer volume of activity we ask our congregants to participate in. We tell our people that we want them to build relationships with their non-Christian neighbors, but we also expect them to attend a small group, prayer meeting, special events we plan for them, serve in a ministry, protect their family time, have strong devotional habits, attend church on Sunday, and so on. When is there any time left for building a friendship with anyone outside the church? Model 2. I'm suggesting we tweak the model. making the activities we normally associate with spiritual formation a larger part of our pre-conversion efforts as well. A more holistic approach allows conversion to take place via a process rather than an event, and encourages potential disciples to see the Christian life up close and to count the cost of becoming a Christ follower. In employing many of the same ministry structures for believers and those investigating, we help believers make friendship with those who are far from God part of the normal Christian life rather than an optional extra. On my napkin, this model would look like figure 3.2. In this diagram, there is only one line, representing both evangelism and spiritual formation. This model presupposes that more often than not, conversion is a process, not a one-time encounter. Here, the believer comes alongside the non-Christian as a spiritual friend, and invites the friend's participation in a number of Christian activities, represented by the marks on the line. These might include any number of activities: a small group, worship gathering, service events, social gathering, etc., depending on where the person is on their journey and which steps are most appropriate at any given time in helping him or her move toward a relationship with Christ. Those investigating the faith are invited into and embraced by the community of faith, allowing them to discover faith from the inside, rather than having to make up their minds before really experiencing what the Christian life is like. The dotted line in figure 3.2 represents the point of conversion. It is dotted not because the conversion is uncertain, but because we may not be able to identify a day or hour when the person crossed over the line of faith and became a Christ follower. For many who come to faith in this way, the realization that they now believe and have become followers of Jesus comes gradually. The task of disciple making is happening on both sides of the dotted line, and often the activities we use to help make disciples looks very similar from one side of conversion to the other. As I read the Gospels, I see echoes of Jesus' approach in this model. In his ministry, Jesus proclaimed the gospel of the kingdom to committed followers and the crowds alike. Both the crowds and the committed experienced and witnessed the teaching, healing, and deliverance ministries of Jesus. See, for instance, the presence of both the disciples and the crowd in the Sermon on the Mount. Many of the crowd followed only for a short time, to investigate or to enjoy the benefits of healing and feeding. But many others at some point in the process became true believers, like Nicodemus. Jesus sums up this characteristic of his ministry in the parable of the soils. Jesus seemed largely unconcerned with who was in and who was out. "You do not want to leave too, do you?" he said in John, but simply called all to follow regardless of where they were at in the process, always inviting them to go deeper. This does not mean there wasn't deliberate preaching directed to the unconverted, and instruction on the spiritual life directed toward the already committed. Rather, Jesus' approach fostered a process that naturally included both aspects of disciple making, evangelism and formation. It appears that a similar dynamic existed in the first century church as well, because both believers and inquirers were present when the church gathered for worship. Paul urges the church to take care that their worship is understandable and beneficial to both groups. This was also true in the ancient church up through at least the 4th century. Seekers were invited to participate in a process of experience and investigation within the church community, which eventually brought them to conversion and to ongoing spiritual formation. My contention is that such an approach is biblically faithful, brings with it a number of benefits, and is especially suited for ministry in a postmodern context. This approach allows seekers to see and experience the Christian life before they commit to it. There is ample opportunity, not just to decide if Jesus is the truth, but also to see what it means to be his disciple. This reduces the rate of attrition and the follow-up required for a new believer. In my experience, the typical person coming to salvation by this approach has already been praying, reading the Bible, and attending worship gatherings and a small group for at least 3 months before conversion. So in many ways, follow-up is a non-issue. By intentionally shaping our ministry structures to be effective in both outreach and spiritual formation, evangelism is demarginalized and integrates more naturally into the everyday lives of believers. This approach also deals realistically with the limited amount of time that people with families and jobs have to invest in church-related activities. Within this type of framework, what will our approaches to evangelism and spiritual formation look like? How will these practices change as we minister to those with a more postmodern worldview? The remainder of this chapter will examine shifts in our thinking that we need to make as we approach evangelism. In Chapter 4, we'll examine shifts in our approach to spiritual formation. Fruit versus roots. My friend Dave Olson is the director of church planting for the Evangelical Covenant Church, a role which has given him a front row seat to the changes in our culture and in ministry over the past 15 years. He describes the differences between evangelism in baby boomer churches and in churches who are reaching out to postmoderns like this. Evangelizing baby boomers is like picking fruit from an aging tree, while evangelizing postmoderns is like fertilizing the roots in hope that fruit will one day appear. With the baby boomers, particularly between 1980 and 2000, ministry occurred in the midst of a secular culture that retained some religious memory. Enough of the trappings of Christendom remained that previous models could be tweaked and would still reach some people. The tree didn't have nearly as much fruit on it as it did in generations past, but it could be found if a person went to the right branches. Evangelism strategies revolved around finding the best ways to pick the fruit. With postmoderns, ministry happens in a secular yet spiritually curious context. Little religious memory is present. The church now functions on the margins and exists for most as a sort of cultural curiosity. Fruit is hard to find, and much of the work of evangelism is digging around the tree's roots and fertilizing. Strategies revolve around how to best cultivate the soil while being attentive to the fruit that does appear on the tree. And when I'm with leaders of emerging churches, I find reactions to the topic of evangelism very interesting. Some are embarrassed when the topic comes up, a reaction I know well, because they know the importance but aren't doing it very well or aren't seeing much in the way of results. I find others, though, who say things like, "We're not really about that," or "We're not too concerned with sharing the gospel, just living it." Still, others say they value evangelism, but feel that to highlight the more neglected aspects of the gospel, we must stop talking about, or at least greatly de-emphasize, evangelism. I recognize the temptation here. The soil has gotten harder, and every conversion comes as the result of many hours of prayer and sweat. We know that the old strategies aren't working, but the new strategies have not yet matured, and there are few tools to replace those that have been set aside. What's more, as we rediscover a more robust theology of the kingdom and a healthy longing for compassion and justice, practices for which results and gratification are immediate and tangible, it becomes more and more appealing to direct our outward-focused efforts toward these practices and to neglect evangelism. Evangelism in this environment is hard. There are no two ways about it. But how can we claim to be faithful to the gospel without a theology that values conversion? While we should not reduce the message to this alone, it is undeniable that Jesus came to seek and save the lost. This church is tasked with the continuation of that rescue mission. This invitation to life in Christ is the core, heart, or center of mission. Scott McKnight issues a timely warning to the emerging church, pointing out that mainline church leaders in the early 20th century never meant to abandon evangelism when they began to elevate the social aspects of the gospel. Yet that is exactly what happened. We cannot afford to be passive about reaching our generation. It is precisely because evangelism is so difficult in a postmodern world that Christian leaders must keep this value in front of our people. I'm struck whenever I read Paul's charge to Timothy, his gifted yet timid protege: do the work of an evangelist. Paul reminds him, similarly, as we discharge the duties of our ministries, we need to consistently teach God's heart for the lost and hurting, instruct our churches in evangelism in the best ways we know how, and find ways to model it in our own lives. Shifting from baskets to shovels. If more of our efforts are indeed directed at cultivating the soil, we need to rethink the tools needed for evangelism in the 21st century. As we do so, there are three broad shifts I suggest we make. The first of these shifts is from evangelism as an event to evangelism as a process. Modern evangelistic efforts find their theological basis in Paul's conversion, as opposed to the conversion of the 12 disciples. Consequently, most of our tools are designed to create a mini Damascus Road event for a person. Crusade evangelism, the altar call, sharing a tract with a person, all of which call a person to an on-the-spot decision for or against Christ. The proclamation of the message is itself considered the Damascus Road experience. Though this approach is occasionally successful with those who have no Christian background, it is most effective with those who already hold some belief in Jesus and need to be called to commitment. In contrast, postmodern people typically need more time. Their shallow prior experience with Christianity, distrust of the church as an institution, skepticism over truth claims, and preference for religious pluralism make it very difficult to manufacture a Damascus Road event. Furthermore, for the postmodern, truth is discerned primarily by experience. Of course, Jesus will continue to meet some in a more dramatic fashion, but we should expect that most will be convinced of the reality of Christ over time. Evangelism as a process will be the norm. As we grapple with this shift in the local church, we need to develop tools that do not discount Paul's experience, but which draw from the experience of the 12 as well. We need to facilitate an evangelism process in which we allow people to walk with Jesus and his people over time, without the pressure to make up their minds during that one encounter. The second shift needed in 21st century evangelism is from impersonal to personal. Most of the tools utilized in modern evangelism are essentially impersonal. The altar call, which has been popular in the United States since the mid-1800s, is a case in point. The relationship between the preacher and the hearer is usually non-existent. This is even less personal in settings where a person's conversion is completely anonymous. Sometimes those responding are told to pray and invite Jesus into their hearts while every head is bowed and every eye is closed, making this an isolated decision in which even those sitting nearby are unaware that a decision for Christ may have occurred. Crusade evangelism is also an impersonal exchange between a speaker and a stadium full of people. Likewise, I believe that much of the commonly practiced one-on-one evangelism, though occurring face-to-face, is impersonal. It often involves an encounter between a Christian with a tract and a total stranger. Little or no relationship exists beforehand, and ordinarily there is no relationship afterward, even if a person expresses a decision for Christ. In contrast, it is very important in a postmodern setting for evangelism to be personal. Trust is not built in a vacuum but in relationship. Even though many find evangelism and strangers frightening, many more will admit it is more frightening with friends. It takes less emotional energy to risk rejection with someone you will never see again than it does to cultivate a real relationship with someone who does not know Christ. Doug Pagitt states it well. People who can change our beliefs are people to whom we give the authority to suggest alternatives to us. It's hard to get around the idea of belief as a relational process. Believers wanting to introduce Jesus to postmoderns will need to do so will need to do the hard work of cultivating a relationship rather than hoping that a hit-and-run approach will be enough. The third shift is from a rational to an embodied apologetic. Rational apologetics will continue to be an important tool, but an embodied apologetic will be the first foot forward in convincing postmoderns of the truth of the faith. In suggesting these shifts, I want to be careful not to appear overly critical of any of the evangelistic tools mentioned previously. Countless people have found Christ as a result of these, and they offer much to commend. These approaches should be commended first for their intentionality, which the emerging church often lacks. In struggling with how to approach a shifting culture, emerging churches often fail to practice evangelism at all. Also, many of these approaches are good examples of contextualization. They were well suited to their time and cultural circumstances, even if they aren't well suited for a postmodern mission field. Door-to-door evangelism, for instance, made sense in a time when people opened their doors to buy vacuums, encyclopedias, and hairbrushes. Currently, this approach has been largely abandoned, even by modern churches, as so few people appreciate salespeople coming to their door. These approaches do, however, bring certain theological implications we need to keep in mind as we evaluate them, and as we develop new tools as well. Evangelistic methods that are event-oriented, impersonal, and more rational than embodied contribute to the bracketing off of evangelism from the rest of the Christian's life. In addition, such an approach virtually invites non-participation at a church level in the life of a new convert. It should come as no surprise that evangelism thus removed from the church results in very high attrition rates. In addition, these approaches should also raise some concern in terms of the authenticity of the resulting conversions. Have those who prayed a sinner's prayer actually come into a saving relationship with Jesus? Is there saving faith behind the prayer, or are they merely mouthing words? We need to be reminded that it is faith that saves us, not the words a person recites. Too often we treat such a prayer as a defining test of salvation, rather than looking at the fruits that come with repentance. Borrowing the words of Jesus in the parable of the soils, we must be careful that we do not rush to assure a person of the efficiency of his or her conversion when the seeds may in fact have fallen on the path or on rocky or thorny soil. Time and the resulting fruit will tell if the conversion is real or not. First century evangelism in the 21st century. I want to close this chapter with one final passage from the ministry of Paul that I find especially helpful as we consider making disciples in our increasingly post-Christian mission field. The church in Colossae was started as a result of the church planting movement ignited in Ephesus, where Luke tells us the gospel spread so rapidly that in 2 years' time all the Jews and Greeks who lived in the province of Asia Minor heard the word of the Lord. In the conclusion of his letter to the Colossian believers, Paul reminds them of their vocation as God's missionary people and instructs them as they continue in the work of the gospel in their context. Pray. Devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful, Paul says, and pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message, so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. Pray that I may proclaim it clearly, as I should. Paul begins his exhortation to the young church with a reminder to rely on God's power, not their own. The difficulty of ministry in a culture without Christian roots serves as a vivid reminder that salvation is a supernatural event, and only God can bring it about. This is a value that he models even as he asks them to pray for him as well. Such evangelistic prayer has several distinct qualities. First, it is constant. Paul calls the Colossians to devote themselves to prayer. This is not a passing activity, but ongoing labor on behalf of those lost people that God puts in our lives. As Oswald Chambers wrote, prayer does not equip us for greater works. Prayer is the greater work. If we are to see God's work in people's lives, we need to be diligent in our prayer for them. Second, such prayer is attentive to what God is doing. Paul tells these believers to be watchful and thankful as they pray. Throughout the book of Acts, Luke reports how in every new city, Paul is able to seek out those people who are open to the gospel, and these people form the core of each new church plant. Paul operates with an understanding that God is at work, and we need to have our eyes open to see in whom God is doing his work. And Paul does so in a spirit of gratitude, rejoicing even in the face of tremendous suffering as God's work goes forward. This same dynamic can be seen in the instructions Jesus gave the 72 as he sent them out into towns where Jesus had not yet gone. He instructed them to first offer a blessing when they came to a house, and if the head of the house loves peace, they were to stay there and proclaim and demonstrate the reality of the kingdom. Third, and related to this attentiveness, Paul prays that God will open doors for their message. He asks God to go ahead of them, preparing hearts and creating opportunities for them to speak. Finally, Paul prays that when the opportunities do come, that he will be faithful with the message, proclaiming the mystery of the gospel clearly. As Starbucks has become my unofficial office, it has become my habit to silently pray for the crew members and regular customers as I work. I pray for God's blessing on them and pray that God will draw them to himself. Many of these people have become friends, and it is amazing to watch how over time people's hearts soften toward me and then toward God. Over time, I've found that I'm better off not sharing the gospel until I've spent a lot more time praying that a door will open for the message. When I'm faithful to pray, more often than not, I find out the door has popped open because my friend will suddenly approach me and start asking questions about God. For a long time, I prayed that God would draw to himself a young barista named Kelly. One morning, as I was ordering my coffee, she blurted out, "I'm breaking up with my boyfriend tonight." I looked behind me to see who she was talking to, but sure enough, it was me. I listened as she shared the reason she felt she needed to do this. In her growing recognition that God wanted her out of this unhealthy relationship, I said, "Thanks for sharing that with me, Kelly. I'll be praying for you tonight." She sighed a grateful thank you and moved on to the growing line of customers behind me. The next day, during her break, I asked how it went, and a spiritual friendship began. We talked all about the God who made her and loves her, and cares deeply that she finds love with a man who would treat her as she deserves. I and others in our faith community had the privilege of walking with her as she rediscovered her faith and as God brought deep healing in her life. Now she is part of our leadership and shepherds one of our ministry teams. I prayed for a long time for another woman, a young woman at Starbucks, a single mom who was working her way through school. I was disappointed when she transferred to another location before a spiritual friendship could develop between us, but was thrilled 2 years later to be greeted by her when I was visiting one of our congregation's church plants. Unbeknownst to me, God had been working in her heart, and through a whole different web of relationships, she ended up following Jesus as part of our daughter congregation. I find it significant that more than half of Paul's instructions in this passage are about how to pray, because I've come to believe that the bulk of the work of evangelism is prayer. Salvation is the work of God, and his work of evangelism always precedes ours. Act. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Second, Paul reminds the Colossians that their actions will be an important part of their witness to those around them. This gets to the heart of the embodied apologetic we are discussing. As others experience God in our midst, see the quality of love lived out in our community, and see the practical enacting of our faith bringing good to the surrounding world, our faith becomes more real to them. Last night after worship, I talked to a young woman who had deterred from her faith some years back, one of the many de-churched people God loves to bring us. I had seen her while I was giving the message, and could see in her face that she was really being affected. I saw her again as we worshipped and took communion. And by this point she was sobbing. After the service we were talking, and when we were out of the hearing of others, she said, "I want to tell you what brought me here. My friend James has been inviting me to this church for about a year, and he told me he was speaking tonight. James is a young man in our church who is gay and is struggling with the realities of living faithfully as a follower of Jesus. He has been wonderfully open with our church about how tough the battle has been and the wins and losses he's experienced in leading a celibate life." "That's great you came out to support him," I replied. "It's more than that," she said as tears again filled her eyes. "I know a lot of Christians, but the only person who consistently invites me to church is my gay friend. He loves it here and always talks about the grace he is experiencing. And I just had to know, what kind of church is this that my gay friend can feel so accepted in and be so excited about?" For her and many others that have found their way to Life Covenant Church, it was the actions and attitude of the community displayed and relayed through a friend that led them to consider Christ. Speak. Finally, Paul instructs the Colossians on the posture of their verbal witness. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. Much of modern evangelism and apologetics tends to have a combative, pushy tone, reminiscent of a formal debate on the one hand or an aggressive sales pitch on the other. Apologetics as martial arts, as one commenter had described it. Contrary to this, Paul calls the Colossian believers to speech that is graceful and winsome. Two expressions he uses imply that there is something in the way we speak that should cause people to want more. Seasoned with salt would imply that the conversation has an appealing, flavorful, and perhaps thirst-inducing quality to it, that believers would need to answer. Others implies that someone is raising a question. In an incarnational approach to ministry, there is a temptation to pull back at the point of verbal witness. Faithful prayer and wise action have broken up the soil, and the ground is ready to receive seed. But the fact is, if we never actually sow, there will be no harvest. Action alone is insufficient. At the proper time, a verbal witness is essential. Because I spend so much time at Starbucks, a good number of the stories I tell about God's work are set there. A while back, I received an encouraging email from a member of our church who was reflecting on some stories I had shared that night in the message. Here's part of what she wrote. For a while I was thinking, well, he has these stories because he is a pastor and that's what he does every day. Well, that is true. It also reminds me that I am called to the same thing. I have similar opportunities to talk with and pray for the people I work with all day. And I have no excuse not to do it. I really want to pursue that and use my workplace as my own Starbucks. Conclusion. At the heart of Christian mission is the ministry of disciple making. As we consider this mandate in our 21st century context, we will benefit from approaching the task holistically, treating evangelism and spiritual formation as overlapping and interrelated activities rather than as wholly separate ones. This will involve shifts in the way we approach evangelism as well as in the way we approach spiritual formation.